Today we're talking about The Culture of Critique, a highly controversial book by Dr. Kevin MacDonald, a retired professor of psychology. It's controversial because he focuses on the negative influence of some Jews in the changing of Western culture, and he argues that they did these things because they knew it would benefit Jews, and it was often at the expense of whites.
Tonight I'm going to talk about Jews.
MacDonald has been called an anti-Semite many times because of his work, and the Anti-Defamation League has added him to a list of extremists. But a book should be judged on its merits, and that's what we're here to do today. More specifically, in this video we're talking about Franz Boas, the man now known as the father of American anthropology. Before he changed the landscape of American anthropology was largely race-focused. It saw different groups and cultures as largely a product of their race. Once Franz Boas was done, that was all replaced entirely by a culture-focused perspective, and that's what you've seen today, where it's generally understood that anyone can be part of pretty much any culture. There's no biological component to culture or civilization left. So let's learn a little bit more about Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology. First, he was deeply alienated from and hostile to Gentile culture, particularly the cultural ideal of Prussian aristocracy. He engaged in a, quote, lifelong assault on the idea that race was a primary source of the differences to be found in the mental or social capabilities of human groups. He focused on culture at the exclusion of race. Boas almost single-handedly developed in America the concept of culture, which, like a powerful solvent, would in time expunge race from the literature of social science. So this one man had so much influence, but it wasn't because of data at all. Quote, Boas did not arrive at the position from a disinterested scientific inquiry into a vexed if controversial question. There is no doubt that he had a deep interest in collecting evidence and designing arguments that would rebut or refute an ideological outlook, racism, which he considered restrictive upon individuals and undesirable for society. There is a persistent interest in pressing his social values upon the profession and the public. So in other words, it's not like Boas uncovered a bunch of information, and that information led everyone to collectively put aside their previous perspective and come around to a more accepting perspective. In reality, he was on an ideological crusade. But that still doesn't explain how he had so much influence. He's just one guy. How could he change all of American anthropology, especially when he was doing it from an ideological perspective, not from an evidence or fact-based perspective? Well, first, Boas had tenure for over 40 years at Columbia, and his long time there led to his students making up the greater part of the professional core of anthropologists, who in their turn taught other students who continued the tradition.
Franz Boas taught at Columbia University for half a century. The list of his students who went on to set up and teach the subject along his lines at other universities reads like the who's who of American anthropology. By the time of his death, he was rightly regarded by scholars from all over the world as the founding father of American anthropology.
Boas's most influential students were Ruth Benedict, Alexander Goldenweiser, Melville Herkovitz, Alfred Kroeber, Robert Lowy, Margaret Mead, Paul Radin, Edward Sapir, and Leslie Spear. All but Kroeber, Benedict, and Mead were Jewish. But it's not like he was recruiting all Jews, right? There were 3 in that list of 9 who were Gentiles. But Boas specifically recruited Gentiles to keep his science from appearing partisan and compromised. So when I heard that, I was a little bit skeptical. Some of the claims here are astonishing and some aren't. This one was more on the astonishing side, so I looked into it. As you can see, I'm putting the sources for the book and also the sources he cites in his book on the bottom of the screen. For this one, I'm going to go through it right here, right now, to show you the sorts of citations he makes. So first off, he's citing Ephron, and Ephron isn't some random guy. He's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. His book was published by Yale University Press. This isn't some crackpot. But what's more, I was able to actually find the book on Google Books, so we can take a look at the page that's being cited right here. Himself a German Jew, Boas sought to organize a research program designed to refute scientific racism. So in other words, he decided to create a research program with the ends already in mind. Great scientist right there. Obviously impartial. Given the state of race relations in general and the extent of anti-Semitism in American society in particular, Boas was concerned that his Jewishness would make his science appear partisan and thus compromised. In 1933, to challenge scientific racism, he enlisted the assistance of non-Jewish scientists such as Robert McIver, Leslie Dunn, and A.T. Poffenberger. In addition to this project, the Boasian school of anthropologists, which included Alfred Kroeber, Robert Lowy, Melville Herkovitz, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and the psychologist Otto Kleineberg, played a central role in challenging scientific racism. So, in other words, with a slightly different perspective, but the facts are right there. The citation is correct. This guy clearly was concerned that his Jewishness would be obvious, and so he hired people explicitly because they weren't Jewish. So one of the names there, Margaret Mead, was actually very, very influential, potentially more influential than Boas himself. She wrote a book called Coming of Age in Samoa that he actively promoted and helped her with. Coming of Age in Samoa was basically about how these primitive tribes had it all figured out. They were free of all of the bad things that Europeans had. The book was widely popular and was key to the substitution of race for culture in Americans' minds. It came out later that Mead systematically ignored cases of rape, violence, revolution, and competition in Samoa. When Mead did see negative attributes, such as rape and concern for virginity, they were attributed to Western influence rather than anything innate in them. And you can see that sort of perspective in a lot of leftists today, where they assume that basically every bad thing in the world is the result of European influence. And a lot of it comes back to this flawed study. But none of that mattered in 1915. Because by 1915, the Boasians controlled the American Anthropological Association and held a 2/3 majority on its executive board. In 1919, Boas could state that, quote, most of the anthropological work done at the present time in the United States was done by his students at Columbia. So Boas had a lot of influence. He was a patriarchal father figure, strongly supporting those who agreed with him and excluding those who did not. He didn't tolerate theoretical or ideological differences with his students. Individuals who disagreed were simply excluded. This really doesn't seem like science, does it? It seems like they have an ideological perspective that they're trying to actively push through science, through social science. Boas was instrumental in completely suppressing evolutionary theory and anthropology. After the rise of the Boasians, violence in primitive groups went unstudied and unmentioned, and when a rogue anthropologist did study it, his work was completely ignored and he was shunned by the rest of the anthropological community. As a result, society at large began to see violence as a uniquely European invention, and saw Europeans as the cause of all the violence in the primitive tribes. Research on racial differences ceased, and the profession completely excluded eugenicists and racial theorists. The takeover was complete. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is basically one half of one of 6 chapters in the book. I'm planning on making other videos covering the other parts of Culture of Critique. If you like this kind of video, please let me know. And of course...
Hey, you enjoyed the video? Maybe you should subscribe. It's a button right here.
Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionary biologist who taught at Harvard and was most active from the late 70s until his death in 2002. He had a lot of influence on the general public because he wrote books targeting a popular audience, appeared on talk shows, and had his own special on PBS. He was also Jewish, and a figure covered at length in The Culture of Critique by Kevin MacDonald. He's actually one of the main reasons that lots of regular people today are skeptical of IQ, despite the fact that basically everyone in the scientific community believes in it and actively uses it in their studies.
I really wonder about the whole quantifying intelligence thing.
Gould actually thought that human consciousness, intelligence, and the trend toward larger brain size in humans were accidents, and didn't actually help our ancestors survive. In the 1996 edition of his book, The Mismeasure of Man, Gould continued to state that G, general intelligence, is just a statistical artifact. He didn't address any of the significant criticism that had come out since the first edition of his book was released in 1981. So in other words, he didn't believe in IQ at all, and he thought that intelligence and human consciousness weren't helpful for our ancestors in surviving, that these things just arose by accident.
Why do you think American society is so obsessed with IQ?
I don't know that we're obsessed by it, but I think it arises largely in the context of the lamentable history of our racism.
Those beliefs aren't backed up at all by the scientific community. But what's more, he wasn't just wrong, he was dishonest. Despite the scientific community's widespread recognition of Gould's dishonesty, he was highly publicized as a public spokesperson on evolution and intelligence. Quote, he has come to be seen by non-biologists as the preeminent evolutionary theorist. In contrast, the evolutionary biologists with whom I have discussed his work tend to see him as a man whose ideas are so confused as to be hardly worth bothering with. All this would not matter were it not that he is giving non-biologists a largely false picture of the state of evolutionary theory. That's from John Maynard Smith. Unfortunately, it's hard to show someone, let alone prove to someone, what the scientific community at large believes. It's much easier to point to a Harvard scientist and say, look, he doesn't believe in IQ, so I don't believe in IQ either. Even if that guy is like a crazy outlier with tons more influence than he deserves. MacDonald cites many different distinguished scientists in the book, just demolishing Gould. Dennett says that Gould used rhetoric and had a non-scientific agenda. Quote, Kamen and Gould present a highly exaggerated and largely false account of the general attitudes of the testing community on the subject of ethnic group differences in intelligence. The other thing about Gould is that he would be destructively skeptical. Quote, Gould offers no alternative ideas to account for all of these well-established observations. His mission in this area appears entirely nihilistic. So he would say, oh, IQ doesn't exist, none of these things matter, none of these things are actually there. But then he wouldn't actually supply any alternative to explain all of the things that IQ does actually explain. That's why it's a respected idea, because it has predictive power. That's how science works. To go any further, we should bring up Henry H. Goddard, a psychologist and eugenicist who preceded Gould. He was an early advocate of intelligence testing, and worked on a study investigating the heritability of, quote, feeble-mindedness. Gould viciously attacked Goddard in his book, The Mismeasure of Man. But it's not like it was a fair critique. Gould engaged in a single-minded pursuit of Goddard, presenting a false picture of Goddard as a rigid hereditarian or elitist. Gould ignored Goddard's published doubts, his qualifications, and his statements about the importance of the environment. He strawmanned him, basically. Gould was engaging in scholarly fraud. He would ignore passages that went against his points, and the quotes were often right next to other quotes that he would use. So Gould misled the public, intentionally. Why would he go and do something like that? Well, we already said he was Jewish. His family embraced Jewish culture. He learned Marxism from his father, and he was a Marxist throughout his life. Gould's family regularly read the Forward, which was a Yiddish daily newspaper that was radical in tone, left radical. Quote, It does not seem to me entirely implausible to suggest that Gould's passion against human sociobiology was linked to the fear that it was yet another tool which could be used for anti-Semitic purposes. I did ask Gould about this once. He did not entirely repudiate the idea, but inclined to think that the opposition stemmed more from Marxism. And as it so contingently happens, most American Marxists are from Eastern European Jewish families. Perhaps both factors were involved. So, frankly, to me, I don't particularly care whether he was trying to combat anti-Semitism or whether he believed these things because he was a Marxist. Either way, he wasn't believing them because they were scientifically valid. He was coming in with his prejudices as presuppositions, and he was arguing for things ultimately in bad faith, because in science, you're supposed to be arguing things from a scientific perspective. And he would shield things in science, and he would use rhetoric and all of these different tools to try to ultimately hide the fact that he had an ethnic or philosophical interest in these things. Michael Ruse said that a very prominent theme of Gould's The Mismeasure of Man was how hereditarian views on intelligence had been used by, quote, Teutonic supremacists to discriminate against Jews early in the century. So that's it for Gould. There were actually a couple other figures, Richard Lerner and Kamen, who were addressed in the same chapter by Kevin MacDonald, and ultimately they're very similar. They're both Jewish, they're both radical, they both use deceptive tactics, and they were both especially concerned about the link between genetic testing of IQ and the genocide of Jews. Lerner actually wrote a book called Final Solutions: Biology, Prejudice, and Genocide. And so this wasn't just an isolated incident, this wasn't just Gould, it was a whole wave of influence that has, I think, to some degree been beaten back by the scientific community. So that's the end of this video. The next video will be on Chapter 3, Jews and the Left, so if that sounds interesting, don't forget to subscribe. Also, one thing we forgot to mention in the last video is if you're really enjoying the series, then buy the book. All the content's coming from there. There's a ton of great stuff in it that unfortunately we're not covering in these videos just because we're trying to make them short. So please, please, please buy the book. Support Kevin MacDonald. I'll put a link in the description. Thanks. I'll see you guys next time. When you're first clued in to the JQ, one of the first red pills is just how many prominent communists were Jewish. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, those communists executed for treason in the US, were Jewish. If you remember the Hollywood blacklist, which was when people in Hollywood, specifically Hollywood writers, refused to answer questions in Congress about their communist involvement and so were blacklisted by Hollywood, 6 of those 10 people were Jewish. Moving to the Soviet Union, in the first Politburo, Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Stalin, Sokolnikov, and Bubnov, 5 out of those 7 members were Jewish. The big name in German communism was Rosa Luxemburg, and she was Jewish too. Talking about the figureheads is interesting and easy to prove, but it also doesn't speak to the larger character of the movement. So let's talk about that. In the US, quote, Jews played a very prominent role in the Communist Party of the United States. For instance, from 1921 to 1961, Jews were about 33% of the Central Committee members and above 40% of the overall membership. In the 1930s, Jews, quote, constituted a substantial majority of known members of the Soviet underground in the US, and almost half of the individuals prosecuted under the Smith Act of 1947. In the US, the leadership of the Communist Party was basically a Jewish organization. Here's a quote from David Horowitz. What my parents had done in joining the Communist Party and moving to Sunnyside was to return to the ghetto. There was the same shared private language, the same hermetically sealed universe, the same dual posturing revealing one face to the outer world and another to the tribe. More importantly, there was the same conviction of being marked for persecution and specially ordained, the sense of moral superiority toward the stronger and more numerous Goyim outside. Here's a Gentile communist talking about his experience at a communist-sponsored youth conference in Wisconsin. Quote, it became increasingly apparent to most participants that virtually all of the speakers were Jewish New Yorkers. Speakers with thick New York accents would identify themselves as the delegate from the Lower East Side or the comrade from Brownsville. Again, this was a national U.S. event held in Wisconsin. The overrepresentation was so crazy, it's sometimes funny. For instance, quote, Hanukkah services were held and the Israeli national anthem were sung during an important sit-in at Berkeley. Moving to the Soviet Union, it wasn't just the communist Politburo. Quote, individual Jews played an important and sometimes decisive part in the leadership of the three main socialist parties, including the Bolsheviks. In Hungary, the communist government was, quote, completely dominated by Jews. 95% of the leading figures of Bela Kun's government were Jews. In Poland, the entire society was basically split along Jew-Gentile lines when it came to the Soviet government. Quote, the general opposition between the Jewish-dominated Polish communist government supported by the Soviets and the nationalist anti-Semitic underground helped forge the allegiance of the great majority of the Jewish population to the communist government, while the great majority of non-Jewish Poles favored the anti-Soviet parties. There were so many Jews, in fact, that you saw cases where Jews specifically recruited Gentiles to make the movement look less Jewish. In the US, quote, efforts were made to recruit Gentiles as window dressing to conceal the extent of Jewish dominance. In Poland, quote, apart from members of the generation whose political loyalties could be counted on and who formed the leadership core of the group, Jews were often discouraged from joining the movement out of fear that the movement would appear too Jewish. However, Jews who could physically pass as Poles were allowed to join and were encouraged to state that they were ethnic Poles and to change their names to Polish-sounding names. So it's pretty clear that these different communist movements all over the world were overwhelmingly led by Jews and staffed by Jews. Considering communism is anti-establishment, anti-tradition, anti-religion, and generally anti-nationalist, you would think that these Jews would give up their Judaism. Largely, they didn't. Generally, they got special treatment and privileges by virtue of being the ruling class. In the Soviet Union, they couldn't legally practice religious Judaism, but at the same time, even though the official ideology viewed nationalism and ethnic separatism as reactionary and thus bad, the Soviet government created a Jewish section of the Communist Party. Yiddish became the recognized language of the Jewish nationality, and state-sponsored Yiddish schools were set up. In Poland, quote, Jewish activists had an ethno-political vision in which Jewish secular culture would continue in Poland with the cooperation and approval of the government. The result was that, quote, while the government campaigned actively against the political and cultural power of the Catholic Church, collective Jewish life flourished in the post-war period. Yiddish and Hebrew language schools and publications were established, as well as a great variety of cultural and social welfare organizations for Jews. So in other words, they suppressed the Catholic Church, they demonized nationalism, and then they had as much religion and nationalism as they wanted in Poland because they were the ruling class. Oftentimes, you'd see anti-nationalist, overwhelmingly Jewish, communist organizations in conflict with nationalistic, ethnic, leftist organizations. In Germany, quote, the conflict between Luxemburg's reactionary left and the social democratic reformists in Germany had overtones of German Jewish ethnic conflict, given the large percentage and high visibility of Jews among the former. In the Soviet Union, quote, the conflict in the 1920s between Stalin and the left opposition, led by Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Solkonikov, all of whom were ethnic Jews, had strong overtones of a Jewish-Gentile group conflict. In Poland, the KPP was sometimes called the Jew Commune, and was viewed by the great majority of Poles as foreign and wanting to serve Moscow instead of Poland. And I think they were right to think that. The KPP supported the Soviet Union in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1920, and in the Soviet invasion of 1939. So in other words, a supposedly Polish movement literally supported a foreign government in a war against Poland, and that group was predominantly Jewish, and then people are surprised when they find out that Polish people are anti-Semitic. I would probably be anti-Semitic too in their position. So taking a step back, imagine you're Jewish. You have more in common linguistically, ethnically, and religiously with small communities around the globe in different countries than you do with any individual country. What you would normally call nationalism, putting your kinsmen above everyone else, would be something closer to globalism for Jews. I think that's why Jewish communism always has this globalist focus. The other thing that's important to remember about how many of these communist movements were overwhelmingly Jewish is that Jews were second-class citizens in many of these countries before the communist revolutions. A revolution promised equal or preferred status. Quote, during the 1930s, the Polish government developed policies in which Jews were excluded from public sector employment, quotas were placed on Jewish representation in universities and the professions, and government-organized boycotts of Jewish businesses and artisans were staged. In the Soviet Union, Jewish literary life flourished under the Soviets, and, quote, the thrust of their prose, poetry, and drama boiled down to one idea: the limitations on their rights under Tsarism and the flowering of once oppressed Jews under the sun of the Lenin-Stalin Constitution. In the US, quote, for many Jewish new leftists, the revolution promised to avenge the sufferings and to right the wrongs which have for so long been inflicted on Jews with the permission or encouragement, or even at the command, of the authorities in pre-revolutionary societies. Communism is generally portrayed as a class war, where the proletariat are trying to topple the bourgeoisie and take control for themselves. When you learn stuff like this, communism starts to look more like a racial war, where Jews who are treated as second-class citizens are trying to get control of the government for themselves. It happened in Poland, Hungary, and it would have happened in the Soviet Union if Stalin hadn't purged all the Jews. And it's probably what would have happened around the world and in the United States if communist revolutions had happened there. Really makes you think. To close out the video, one of our first subscribers ever, Dumbleton, mentioned that he liked that we did some fact-checking in the first video. So for this video, I decided to look a little bit more deeply at a book that Dr. MacDonald cites a lot when he's writing about Poland, The Generation, The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Communists of Poland, by Jaf Schatz. Schatz was the director of the Institute for Jewish Culture at Lund University, which is a fairly prestigious university in Sweden. I decided to focus on one particular quote from The Culture of Critique. Jewish activists had an ethno-political vision in which Jewish secular culture would continue in Poland with the cooperation and approval of the government. I think that's kind of a central quote because it's one of the many claims that's made in the book, basically, that Jews are trying to do this mostly to serve their own interests. They want to keep Jewish culture continuing. Page number is cited 230. Thankfully, this entire book appears to be on Google Books, so we can actually look at that page and the surrounding pages. So just for context, when he's talking about activists here, he's talking specifically about politically radical Jewish communists that basically have control of Poland at this point. Beginning in 1949 to 50, the activists became the undisputed leaders of all those involved in Jewish political, social, and economic institutions in Poland. As such, they administered the official Jewish sector and formulated its ideology. Within the generation, the ethnic content of their vision formed one of the poles in the most important division that split its members, dividing them into Jewish Jews and assimilationists. The activists were guided by an ambition to shape Jewish collective post-war life according to the content of their ethno-political vision. In this vision, Jewish secular culture would bloom under socialist conditions. And it goes on to talk about all of these Hebrew schools and Yiddish schools and stuff like that that furthered the Jewish life under this time. And that seems to roughly fit what Kevin MacDonald was talking about. The main problem I have with this, though, is that it talked specifically about assimilationists. It talked about Jewish Jews as opposed to assimilationists. And the presence of assimilationists is kind of absent from Dr. MacDonald's coverage of this work and generally these different leftist movements in these different countries. And I don't want to go into too much detail because the video got really long, but I read about another 30 or 40 pages of this book that he's citing, and it seems to be making the case that a Jewish identity sort of disappeared in the next decade or so as people stopped speaking Yiddish, stopped speaking Hebrew, these schools shut down, etc., etc. I want to actually look into this a little bit more. I'm going to read this book, I'm going to make a video on it, I'm going to learn about it, and that way I can provide an informed opinion to you guys. So that's not really the way I wanted to end this, but I think it is important to stay intellectually honest, and I'll still make a video on the next chapter, which is on Freud and psychoanalysis, very soon. So I'll see you guys then. Today, we're going to talk about Freud and the movement he started, psychoanalysis. Like all the subjects in the culture of critique, both Freud and psychoanalysis itself were Jewish. Although Freud downplayed his religious education and his knowledge of Hebrew, Yiddish, and Jewish religious traditions, in a private letter, Freud described himself as, quote, a fanatical Jew. He was a Zionist, and none of his kids converted to Christianity or married Gentiles. Freud also had a racial understanding of the Jewish people. Speaking about Europeans, he said, quote, whereas their human culture had repressed their primitive sexuality in the ascent to civilization, Jews possessed special creative powers, since they had been able to maintain a direct relation to nature, to primitive sexuality. So Freud believed that Jews had a special understanding of primitive sexuality. He also believed that artificially restricted sexuality led to many of the problems of society. So in a way, it's obvious that Freud would see psychoanalysis, which is digging into primitive sexuality and how it affects culture, as connected to Judaism. Freud thought it would be hard for non-Jews to understand psychoanalysis for what sounds like racial reasons. And from the beginning, psychoanalysis was overwhelmingly Jewish. Quote, in 1906, all 17 members of the movement were Jewish, and they strongly identified as Jews. Freud was conscious of the overwhelmingly Jewish nature of the movement and took steps to make it seem less Jewish, much like the Jewish communists of the previous video and Gould from the first video. And again, it was a self-consciously Jewish movement. Quote, the feelings of Jewish superiority alienated many non-Jews within the movement and encouraged many outside the movement to dismiss as hypocritical the humanitarian claims of the psychoanalysts. So you have an overwhelmingly Jewish movement that sees a problem with Gentile society that Jews are in a unique position to diagnose and fix. One of the main ideas in psychoanalysis developed by Freud is the Oedipal complex. It's the idea that it's perfectly natural to want to have sex with your mother and be jealous of your father. It's a totally natural part of development, apparently. It turns out that this idea originated because Freud himself felt that way when he was younger. He just assumed that everyone else felt the same way too, I guess. He also made basically everything about sex. He defined various, quote, psychosexual stages, where children would get sexual satisfaction in different ways, using their mouth first, then their butt, etc. The thing is, all these theories were created by piecing together his reflections and his psychoanalysis of patients. He didn't use data or the scientific method or really science at all. But the lack of scientific rigor didn't stop these ideas from spreading, and part of the reason was the nature of the psychoanalytic movement itself. Psychoanalysis, quote, conducted itself less like a scientific medical enterprise than like a Politburo bent on snuffing out deviationism. There was a suppression of free criticism within psychoanalysis. Freud was treated as a demigod, and no criticism of his utterances was permitted. Carl Jung was the most famous follower of Freud, and he was also a Gentile. He went on to break with Freud and come up with his own ideas. When he left, he criticized Freudians as being intolerant and fanatical. Freud responded by saying that Jung defected due to, quote, strong neurotic and egotistic motives. That was a common thing for Freud. When someone would disagree with some of the tenets of psychoanalysis, like the Oedipal complex, Freud would say that opposition to psychoanalysis stemmed from resistances arising from emotional sources. He would sort of pathologize any opposition to his ideas. It's impossible to actually disagree with him on any kind of intellectual basis, I guess. So, making everything about sex, it turns out, was a little bit controversial in very conservative Christian Europe and the US. It was seen as subversive, and Freud thought so too. After publishing Little Hans, he wrote to a fellow Jew, quote, German ideals threatened again. Our Aryan comrades are really completely indispensable to us. Otherwise, psychoanalysis would succumb to anti-Semitism. So again, he's talking about how useful it is to have these non-Jews around, so that way these obviously subversive ideas aren't seen as entirely Jewish. I traced that quote down to the original source, and you can see it here. It doesn't look like it was taken out of context or anything. Freud saw anyone attempting to restrict sexuality as an enemy, and the cause of most of the problems in society. He wrote, quote, Sexual morality, as society in its extreme form, the American defines it, seems to me very contemptible. I advocate an incomparably freer sexual life. And remember, Freud didn't see these restrictions on sexuality as a human thing. He didn't think it affected Jews at all. He was specifically trying to fix another race and another culture. And after World War II and the Holocaust, Freud was dead, but psychoanalysts generally took the Holocaust as more evidence of pent-up sexual desires. In Wilhelm Reich's book, The Function of the Orgasm, Sex Economic Problems of Biological Energy, whatever that means, he wrote, quote, "The forces which had been kept in check for so long by the superficial veneer of good breeding and artificial self-control broke through into action, in concentration camps, in the persecution of the Jews, in fascism. The psychic mass disease revealed itself in an undisguised form." So in other words, sexual repression, meaning not just constantly having sex and actually having some modesty, leads to Auschwitz. And Wilhelm Reich's ideas weren't just his, it was a common thing. Quote, "The psychoanalysts who emigrated from Europe to the US during the Nazi era expected to make psychoanalysis into the ultimate weapon against fascism, anti-Semitism, and every other anti-liberal bias. Again, they're taking something that really shouldn't be political at all. They're taking what, at least supposedly, is a scientific idea, and then they're using it for political ends. A lot of Freud's ideas are controversial to this day, and the scientific community is divided on many of them. That said, if his goal was to liberate our ideas of sex and to generally deconstruct sexual morality, he totally succeeded. Quote, "What is striking about the 1960s revolution is how revolutionary it was in sensibility as well as reality. In the 7 years between 1965 and 1972, the number of people who thought premarital sex was always or almost always wrong dropped from 69 and 65% to 24 and 21%. And that's ultimately Freud's legacy." That's it for the video. If you enjoyed it, then sub to the channel. You might also want to follow us on Twitter or subscribe on BitChute just in case the channel gets taken down. I'll put those links in the description. Stay tuned for the next chapter on the Frankfurt School. Thanks, guys. The Frankfurt School was a social and political movement started at the Institute for Social Research at the University in Frankfurt, Germany. The Frankfurt School and the Institute for Social Research were basically the same thing. The institute was started by Felix Wiel in 1923, a Jewish millionaire, with the goal of promoting the study of Marxism in Germany. The first generation of the Frankfurt School were all ethnic Jews, and taking the list of notable theorists of the Frankfurt School from Wikipedia, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, Friedrich Pollock, Leo Lowenthal, Siegfried Krekor, Otto Kirchheimer, Jürgen Habermas, Alfred Schmidt, and Axel Honneth. 9 of the 12 were ethnically Jewish, and it was generally viewed as a Jewish group and by more than just the National Socialists in Germany. During the Weimar period in Germany, quote, "The perception that Jewish critical analysis of Gentile society was aimed at dissolving the bonds of cohesiveness with the society was common among educated Gentile Germans, including university professors. And critical analysis is a Frankfurt School specialty." For this video, we're mostly going to focus on Horkheimer and Adorno, who were the largest figures in the Frankfurt School. Felix Wiel wanted to promote Marxism in Germany, and at first Adorno and Horkheimer were perfectly happy with Marxism and a class-based view of the world. Then, reality hit. The proletariat sided with the National Socialists in Germany, and the Frankfurt School had to flee to New York, and the Jews who didn't flee were put into camps. Both Horkheimer and Adorno were heavily influenced by these experiences. Then, the proletarian revolution in Russia turned ugly when Stalin took over, and it wasn't as friendly to the Jews as everyone thought it would be. So they began to see authoritarianism itself as the main enemy. So they were influenced by world-shaking events. Who wouldn't be? Why would it matter if they're just sociologists and professors looking for the truth? Well, they're not. The biggest idea that came out of the Frankfurt School was critical theory. If you read Horkheimer's essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, you'll come away with the idea that critical theory is oriented toward critiquing and changing society, whereas traditional theory is more about understanding or explaining it. And there are downsides, apparently, to traditional theory because by just trying to understand and explain the world, you inevitably side with the power structure that is in control. You're not doing enough, basically. And a true devotee of critical theory is constantly criticizing. All of the ideals of Western society were huge targets. Chastity, the family, the church, the goal of being a pillar of the community, these were all turned on their heads and said to be unhealthy and the cause of society's ills. Chastity in the church caused repression, which eventually led to violence. A close-knit family was a sign of being needy, Wanting prestige meant that you were really empty inside. Their goal was to seriously question the foundations of the society, all the assumptions that everyone made that sort of held the society together, and in a lot of cases invert them. And they weren't after truth or understanding. They wanted to change society. That was their goal. If you've watched all the videos in the series so far, that idea sounds familiar, doesn't it? I hear myself saying the same thing over and over. It's where the title of the book, The Culture of Critique, comes from. Whether we're talking about Boas and race, Gould and IQ, Freud and psychoanalysis, or now Horkheimer and Adorno and sociology, it turns out that the goal of these academics was to push a message rather than to find out the truth. And don't get me wrong, there's a place to push a message. We should be trying to change society. I care about that sort of thing. It's important. But I'm also not an academic. We as a society value the highly learned man who devotes his life to learning and carefully weighs data to advance our knowledge as a civilization. I don't want all those noble men and women replaced by ideologues who just want to push an agenda. And when you look at the way the Institute for Social Research behaved and the way Adorno and Horkheimer wrote, it sounds a lot more like a political organization than a scientific one. Throughout the history of the Institute, to be part of it meant letting your work be heavily edited and your ideas censored. Here's Adorno writing about Erich Fromm, another member of the movement. Quote, Fromm takes the easy way out with the concept of authority, without which, after all, neither Lenin's avant-garde nor dictatorship can be conceived of. I would strongly advise him to read Lenin. I must tell you that I see a real threat in this article to the line which the journal takes. Actual researchers who are after the truth won't consider excluding an article because it deviates from the norm. Later, Fromm was kicked out of the Institute altogether. Herbert Marcuse was another victim of differing ideologies. He was excluded because he was too much of a traditional Marxist. They were an ideological political organization. In one of their studies, they, quote, investigated anti-Semitism. I'm a little hesitant to use the word investigated. Horkheimer was thrilled about it. Quote, research would be able here to transform itself directly into propaganda. If it could be reliably established that a particularly high percentage of criminals were extreme anti-Semites, the result would be as such already propaganda. I would also like to try examining psychopaths in mental hospitals. They also used Freudian reasoning in order to explain things that they could never explain empirically. It turns out, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, that Jews are hated because they're just so wonderful. The Gentiles are just jealous. Quote, happiness without power, wages without work, a home without frontiers, religion without myth. These characteristics are hated by the rulers because the ruled secretly long to possess them. The rulers are only safe as long as the people they rule turn their longed-for goals into hated forms of evil. Also, much like Freud, Horkheimer and Adorno weren't friends of the traditional structure of the societies they lived in. Both had a negative view of traditional Christianity and thought it was related to fascism. They said that both fascism and traditional Christianity involved the, quote, opposition to and subjugation of nature. On the other hand, Judaism was a natural religion and served national life and self-preservation. Horkheimer believed that, quote, the true enemy of the Jews is Gentile collectivities of any kind and especially nationalism. Because of this evil of collectivist nationalism, Adorno wrote that a goal of philosophy is, quote, the negative role of resisting attempts to endow the world with any universality, objectivity, or totality. So science was attacked by Adorno and Horkheimer because it tries to find universal principles of reality. Because objectivity and science are the foundations we build our society on. Once you have science, you can start asking questions about whether policies, ideologies, and groups of people are good or bad for the country, and use data to try and find answers to those questions. According to the Frankfurt School, we can't have that, so we can't have science. Adorno thought that the main goal of a society should be one where, quote, one can be different without fear. It's an obvious goal to have if you're a Jewish man who was kicked out of the country he was raised in and had to flee to another equally alien and hostile country across the ocean. Unfortunately, it seems like the Western world has taken up this goal. Who cares if we're rich? Who cares if we're powerful? Who cares if we're safe? Who cares if our communities are intact and our people are happy? Someone put up a swastika flyer and it might not have been a Jewish hoax this time, so we should focus on that instead. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, you'll love our next one. We're going to focus on the most influential work produced by the Frankfurt School, the authoritarian personality. If you enjoyed the videos, follow us on Twitter, become a patron on Patreon, and of course subscribe to the channel. See you next time. In the previous video, we covered the Frankfurt School generally. Today, we're going to talk about one of the more interesting works to come out of it, the authoritarian personality. The authoritarian personality was sponsored by the Department of Scientific Research of the American Jewish Committee in a series entitled Studies in Prejudice. It was written in 1950 by 4 people: Adorno, who we already covered, Elsa Frankel Brunswick, who was Jewish, Daniel Levinson, who may have been Jewish, I couldn't find any evidence either way, and Nevitt Sanford, who was definitely not Jewish. For what it's worth, Adorno's name was listed first, and he was the most influential and famous of the four. So this was a work written by both Jews and Gentiles, whose research was funded by Jews, and this was right after World War II, and the goal was to figure out why people became anti-Semites, fascists, and authoritarians. To me, this is the situation where the JQ comes in handy. Yes, it's interesting how much influence Jews have. Yes, they seem to be especially interested in universalist causes, banking, the media, and degenerate things like pornography. All of that aside, though, just recognizing that Jews are a separate people is so valuable. A group gets persecuted, flees to another country, and then does research psychoanalyzing why the people who kicked them out thought the way they did. And you expect the result to be impartial? If a bunch of Christians got together and said the reason atheists hadn't accepted Jesus was because their parents abused them, they wouldn't ever be taken seriously. If a bunch of communists got together and said that liberals rejected communism because they were mentally unstable, it wouldn't ever be considered science. And yet with Jews, it's considered anti-Semitic to question how impartial they can be when analyzing people that want to kick them out of countries. Just raising that objection is thought crime. How could you possibly think that Jews might have an interest other than the objective pursuit of knowledge? And it's not like these guys were even hiding their agenda or disguising their biases. Quote, "In Berkeley, we then developed the F-scale, fascist, with a freedom which differed considerably from the idea of a pedantic science which has to justify each of its steps. The reason for this was probably what, over there, might have been termed the, quote, psychoanalytic background of the four of us who were leading the project, particularly our familiarity with the method of free association. I emphasize this because a work like The Authoritarian Personality was produced in a manner which does not correspond at all to the usual image of positivism in social science." That was Adorno. Referring to their theories of anti-Semitism discussed in The Authoritarian Personality, Adorno wrote, quote, "We never regarded the theory simply as a set of hypotheses, but as in some sense standing on its own feet, and therefore did not intend to prove or disprove the theory through our findings, but only to derive from it concrete questions for investigation, which must then be judged on their own merit and demonstrate certain prevalent socio-psychological structures. It's a theory so good you don't even need to look for evidence." And it definitely does come out of the whole Freudian thing, where people just kind of speculate and think about stuff and develop theories, and they never actually have to prove any of it, they just sort of assert it as true. So the Authoritarian Personality has a few different sections. For each of them, a subject would be asked a series of questions, and then their answers would be used to predict whether someone was a potential authoritarian. There was the F scale for fascist, an anti-Semitism scale, an ethnocentrism scale, and a conservatism scale. Some of the questions they asked do make sense. If you want to know whether someone is ethnocentric, it makes sense to ask them about how they feel about other races. On the other hand, there were a lot of questions about the subjects' childhoods. That's where the sort of Freudian influence comes in. And there were other bigger problems. For one thing, the ethnocentrism scale wasn't really an ethnocentrism scale, because the questions weren't worded generally. For instance, one of the questions was, quote, "In view of the present national emergency," which was World War II, "it is highly important to limit responsible government jobs to native white Christian Americans." So, I mean, that would sort of be ethnocentrism if you were asking a white Christian American, but if you were interviewing a Jew or an atheist or like a foreign German man, they wouldn't answer yes if they were ethnocentric. They were specifically referring to white Christian Americans. And also, you'd think an anti-Semitism scale would measure hatred of Jews, but it didn't. One question was, quote, "The trouble with letting Jews into a nice neighborhood is that they gradually give it a typical Jewish atmosphere." But it isn't anti-Semitic to recognize that bringing someone from a different culture into your neighborhood is going to change it and make it more like them. That's just sort of noticing things. It isn't anti-Semitism to want a neighborhood to be one where you can wish your neighbors Merry Christmas and they will respond in kind. And also, if you think that Jews have a disproportionate amount of money or power or involvement in the radical left, that would increase your ranking on the anti-Semitism scale as well. It doesn't matter that those claims are true, just ask the Jewish Daily Forward. Another hint you might be an authoritarian is your relationship with your parents. A highly ethnocentric woman would say something like, quote, "Mother was terribly strict with me about learning to keep house. I'm glad now, but I resented it then." To Adorno, a comment like that is a sign of a horrible relationship with her parents. She was just suppressing her resentment for her mother. If, on the other hand, a child was open about bad experiences with her parents, and acknowledged that her parents really were horrible parents, then that was a sign of a healthy, objective perspective. The child had let go of any trauma and could be open and honest about the childhood. If you didn't openly mention a bad relationship with your parents, then that was seen as a sign of a deep, unconscious psychopathology. The assumption, of course, is that all childhoods are equally horrible, and that the only way to be healthy is to admit that your childhood was horrible. Of course, Adorno doesn't quite put it that way. He says that the highly ethnocentric, quote, glorify their parents, whereas the rest have an objective perspective. It's like Adorno was playing a game. He knew that authoritarianism was bad, and he knew that there were differences between the sorts of people that were ethnocentric and the sorts that weren't. So he had to find a way to turn all of the good things that were associated with the ethnocentric populations into bad things. So when it turned out that low scorers, meaning low in ethnocentrism, mentioned conflict between their parents more often, it was said that they, quote, illustrate the frankness and the greater insight into the marital conflicts of their parents. So the assumption there again is that it's not that their parents fought more, it's that they were more aware of the marital conflicts. I mean, this couldn't possibly be evidence that high scorers actually had happier families. No, the high scorers were just denying that conflict happened. Quote, high-scoring subjects are proud of their families, their accomplishments, and their traditions. And that had to be bad. So having that pride leads to, quote, setting off of a homogeneous totalitarian family against the rest of the world. So pride is bad, right? Also, high scorers had a very positive self-image, whereas low scorers were insecure and far away from their ideal selves. Clearly, this was due to, quote, the repressions of the high scorers and the objectivity of the low scorers. The high scorers couldn't actually be better in any way. It always had to be pathologized. Another trend was that the high scorers, again, high in ethnocentrism, had more social success, more friends, held more offices, and were more interested in material success, basically chads. And these traits were pathologized as gang sociability and seen as a negative. And yeah, this is like totally crazy, right? And it hasn't gone totally unnoticed by the scientific community. From the beginning, the authoritarian personality was seen as having serious problems in the conduction of the research. Quote, unrepresentative subjects in the interview data, the very incomplete and misleading information on the reliability of the measures, and the discussion of insignificant relationships as if they were significant. Those were all problems. So that was Altmaier. And after going through a bunch of the different issues in the authoritarian personality, he wrote, quote, the reader familiar with the matter knows that most of these criticisms are over 25 years old, and this was written in 1988. And now they might be considered little more than flaying a dead horse. Unfortunately, the flaying is necessary, for the horse is not dead, but still trotting around in various introductory psychology and developmental psychology textbooks. For example, methodological criticisms seem to travel a shorter circuit and die a much quicker death than, quote, scientific breakthroughs. In conclusion then, no matter how often it is stated that the Berkeley investigators discovered the childhood origins of authoritarianism, the facts of the matter are anything but convincing. But it didn't matter that the studies were far from impartial. It didn't matter that they were flawed from the beginning. They weren't designed to be scientific, they were designed to be used politically, and they were. The American public had been bombarded with propaganda painting the fascist Germans, Italians, and Japanese as violent psychopaths bent on world destruction. Then 400,000 Americans lost their lives fighting in World War II. A few years later, the largely Jewish immigration reform movement tapped into that propaganda, and the authoritarian personality was a way to paint conservative white Americans as the same as the fascists they had just defeated. And it worked. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act was passed, and the demographics of the U.S. would never be the same. That's what we're going to talk about in the next video, Jewish involvement in U.S. immigration policy. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and share the video with a normie. If you want to vote on what book we cover next, or want to support the channel, please check out our Patreon. I'll put a link in the description. It might also be a good idea to follow us on Twitter and subscribe on BitChute just in case something happens to the channel. Thanks, guys. Quote, communism is racial. A racial minority seized control in Russia and in all her satellite countries. They have been run out of practically every country in Europe in the years gone by, and if they keep stirring race trouble in this country and trying to force their communistic program on the Christian people of America, there is no telling what will happen to them here. No, that wasn't Andrew Anglin or David Duke. That was Representative John Rankin of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1952. That's how aware Gentiles were about Jewish influence back then. Rankin brought it up during the debate on immigration law, and that debate wasn't just about immigration, it was also about what it meant to be an American. Back then, the average American saw the U.S. as a place built by and for Anglo-Saxon Christians, and they were happy to say that openly. But they still had to deal with being called racist in a way that's very familiar today. Here's Representative William N. Vail of Colorado giving a typical American opinion. Quote, let me emphasize here that the restrictionists of Congress do not claim that the Nordic race or even the Anglo-Saxon race is the best race in the world. Let us concede in all fairness that the Czech is a more sturdy laborer with a very low percentage of crime and insanity, that the Jew is the best businessman in the world, and that the Italian has a spiritual grasp and an artistic sense which have greatly enriched the world. Nordics need not be vain about their own qualifications. It well behooves them to be humble. What we do claim is that the Northern European, and particularly Anglo-Saxons, made this country. Oh yes, the others helped, but that is the full statement of the case. They came to this country because it was already made as an Anglo-Saxon commonwealth. They added to it, they often enriched it, but they did not make it, and they have not yet greatly changed it. We are determined that they shall not. It is a good country, it suits us. And what we assert is that we are not going to surrender it to somebody else, or allow other people, no matter what their merits, to make it something different. If there is any changing to be done, we will do it ourselves. That was in 1924, leading up to the quota-based immigration that was passed around that time. Even then, they felt the need to start with, "I'm not a racist, but." Whites couldn't be called Nazis because the National Socialists hadn't risen to power in Germany yet, so they were called Nordic supremacists or Teutonic supremacists instead. And who do you think it was that was calling people racist so much that they felt the need to defend themselves when they just wanted their country to stay more or less the same? It was the same group of people that was trying to change America from a country of people to a country of ideas. One member of that group was an American philosopher named Horace Kalin. He was the son of a rabbi, and he was also a prominent leader of the AJ Congress, AJ meaning American Jewish. He was, quote, largely responsible for the current widespread understanding of the US as a pluralistic society that did not belong to any particular people. This idea of a pluralistic society where a bunch of different people mixed together and made something better was not at all common in the early 1900s, but it was very common among Jews. It became, quote, a hallmark of mainstream American Zionism, secular and religious alike. Jews wanted this sort of society because, frankly, they would feel safer there. Just like Representative Rankin said, Jews had been kicked out of virtually every country they'd ever lived in. Quote, American Jews are committed to cultural tolerance because of their belief, one firmly rooted in history, that Jews are safe only in a society accepting of a wide range of attitudes and behaviors as well as a diversity of religious and ethnic groups. It is this belief, for example, not approval of homosexuality, that leads an overwhelming majority of US Jews to endorse gay rights and to take a liberal stance on most other so-called social issues. In the years before 1965, going all the way back to the founding of the country, the US was between 80 and 90% white, and the vast majority of the rest were black. Those blacks were either slaves or second-class citizens, and so this wasn't a multicultural society. At most, you could say this was a bicultural society with one very junior partner. The thing is, people didn't want that to change. For instance, in the 1920s, evolutionary theories of race and ethnicity were really part of the culture. That was when, quote, scientific racism was at its peak, and eugenics was openly talked about. Madison Grant had recently written his book, The Passing of the Great Race. So for immigration laws to change, for people to feel comfortable letting in all these people different from themselves, Americans' understanding of race and identity had to change too, and so Jews set to work. Quote, Jewish intellectuals were prominently involved in the movement to eradicate the racialist ideas of Grant and others. And these ideas created by these Jewish intellectuals were spread to the public with the help of Jewish organizations. Quote, during the 1930s, Boasian ideology of no racial differences and cultural relativism were sponsored by Jewish activist organizations and widely distributed throughout the American educational system. And while working on the hearts and minds of the next generation, they never gave up petitioning the government directly. Jews have been, quote, the single most persistent pressure group favoring a liberal immigration policy in the US in the entire immigration debate beginning in 1881. When Judge Simon Rifkin testified against the 1952 restrictionist McCarran bill, he said that he represented, quote, the entire body of religious opinion and lay opinion within the Jewish group, religiously speaking, from the extreme right and extreme left. Rifkin represented the AJ Congress, the AJ Committee, the ADL, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the Synagogue Council of America, the Jewish Labor Committee, the Jewish War Veterans of the U.S., and 27 other local Jewish councils throughout the U.S. It was the entire Jewish community. Here's Israel Zangville, quote, hence the endeavor of the Jews to control the immigration policy of the United States. Although theirs is but a seventh of our net immigration, they led the fight on the Immigration Commission's bill. The systematic campaign in newspapers and magazines to break down all arguments for restriction and to calm nativist fears is waged by and for one race. The literature that proves the blessings of immigration to all classes in America emanates from subtle Hebrew brains. So the entire spectrum of Jews in the US came out in full force to change immigration law, and in a self-interested way. As you might expect, some Gentiles noticed. Representative Levitt in the House said, quote, the instinct for national and race preservation is not one to be condemned. No one should be able to better understand the desire of Americans to keep America American than the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Sabbath, who is leading the attack on this measure, or the gentleman from New York, Mr. Dickstein, Mr. Jacobstein, Mr. Seller, and Mr. Perlman. They are of the one great historical people who have maintained the identity of their race throughout the centuries, because they believed sincerely that they are a chosen people, with certain ideals to maintain, and knowing that the loss of racial identity means a change of ideals. That fact should make it easy for them, and the majority of the most active opponents of this measure in the spoken debate, to recognize and sympathize with our viewpoint. And maybe the Jews did understand, but they certainly didn't care. America preserving its identity would be great for America, but it would be bad for the Jews, and that's ultimately what the Jews cared about. And after almost a century of work, starting in the 1880s, they did eventually succeed in 1965. The Hart-Celler Act was passed, and all demographic quotas were removed. Immigration became about skills and family relatedness, and pretty quickly, skills started taking a backseat to family. Quote, in 1986, less than 4% of immigrants were admitted on the basis of needed skills, whereas 74% were admitted on the basis of familial relatedness. And do you think Jews feel bad about erasing American identity? They couldn't be happier. Quote, the Census Bureau has just reported that about half of the American population will soon be non-white or non-European, and they will all be American citizens. We have tipped beyond the point of where a Nazi-Aryan party will be able to prevail in this country. We have been nourishing the American climate of opposition to bigotry for about half a century. That climate has not yet been perfected, but the heterogeneous nature of our population tends to make it irreversible. And he's probably right. I don't think a Nazi-Aryan party will prevail in this country, at least through democracy. But at what cost? Instead of having a unified country around race, culture, and religion, we have a bunch of races, a bunch of cultures, and a bunch of religions. And people like to talk about the benefits of diversity, and I get that there are benefits, but there are also real costs. If 90% of people all come from the same background and have the same general ideas about things, then you can create laws that will make them all happy. If you have a vast diversity of opinion, you're going to end up with laws that no one is going to be happy with. And that widespread unhappiness is going to cause people to lose faith in the prevailing norms of society and look for alternatives. And then they're probably going to push for radical change. I guess if nothing else, it's an exciting time to be alive, and you have the Jews to thank for that. This is the end of our series on the culture of critique. I want to stress that we didn't cover everything, and if you liked anything you heard here, please buy the book and give Kevin MacDonald all the credit. I put a link to the book in the description. And I do hope you liked the series, and we're going to cover a lot more books in the future. If you want to learn about Bowling Alone, which influenced Mike Enoch, Archaeofuturism, which influenced Richard Spencer, or The Bow of Ulysses, which influenced the Neo-Reaction guys, or want to learn about Rules for Radicals or The Protocols, those books are coming. If you're interested in becoming a patron and voting on what book we cover next, I'll put a link in the description. I hope you guys enjoyed the series. I enjoyed making them. I'll see you guys next time, and Merry Christmas.